I'm going to share with you basically how when I look back at my story with the divorce and starting, kind of with nothing. My parents bought me a little laptop computer, one of those little Apple iBooks back in 2010. They wanted to give me their Forerunner because they're Korean, and they're like, "Here, take our car." I want a hug. They first said your wife is divorcing you because you're Korean. I was like, she knew I was Korean anyway. And then they're here, take our car. My dad was crying though, so. But on that little white MacBook, that was all I owned. So I had that, and I was renting a little room in K-Town, and had no friends, had nothing, and I had a lot of time, and that's when I started the blog, Being a Therapist. But that was 2010, and so I went through a survival mode, and I rebuilt my life. And then when I went to therapy school, I started learning all these concepts that were dense. And I had to kind of digest it, put it into my own language just for me to understand. I wasn't trying to come up with anything. I wasn't trying to write a book. I was just saying like, okay, what did I do and what am I doing that I could, like, how can I put it in my own language, How can I bring it to street level? In therapy school, you learn a lot of concepts and they're dense, man. They're just deep and it's like, and then you're like, for me, it was like, how am I going to help people if I can't absorb this myself? So the first thing that was a huge, one of the biggest things is I started with, this comes from Family Systems, Bowen. He talks about raising your differentiation of self. So when you are in a triangle, or like, for example, if mom has a problem with dad, but instead of going directly to dad, mom comes to you, right? That's a triangle, or dad comes to you instead of mom. Raising your differentiation of self means mom, just go to dad. It means pulling yourself out of a triangle, right? A lot of us have very low differentiation of self because of our families and upbringing, enmeshment, codependency, that kind of stuff. So the way that you do it is you stay in your solid self instead of your pseudo. And that resonated with me. I used to be a screenwriter. So the movie that really landed with me was Fight Club. And I'm a very visual person. So when I write, I just write what I see. So Fight Club, I was like, oh, because you guys have all seen Fight Club, right? It's one person. The whole movie is about inner conflict. And I was like, oh, Edward Norton is Pseudo. He is the guy with the one of my biggest pet peeves, the lukewarm dead fish handshake. He was that guy, lost, confused, had no sense of self, just going to meetings. He meets his solid self, who's Brad Pitt, and there's instant resistance, get away from me. And then he starts listening to Brad Pitt, and then he goes on this huge character arc. He finds, he starts a movement. They're doing bad things in the movie, but he starts a movement. He gets the girl. He finds his voice. He becomes a leader. So you see him going from this kind of grayed out person to this, leader and all that. And I was like, so this is what Pseudo looks like. And for me, it was in Hollywood, spending 10 hours a day writing screenplays, hoping that I could, sell the $1 million screenplay so I could buy the house in the hills and then get the cars, and then my life would be perfect. And in 10 years of that made me very grayed out, no direction, no sense of self, chasing shiny things, right? Then divorce, and then after divorce, I was like, okay, what would it look like for me to pull from my solid self? And so that was the beginning of everything. That was the only question I asked myself. And that in your solid self is your authentic self. It's the voice that we usually mute, So if you're discovering right now that you are attracted to women or a woman, that is your solid self, right? Your expansive self, your authentic self. Your pseudo self is, wait a minute, that's maybe I shouldn't, whatever, things that are tied to old definitions, patterns, or whatever. So that there's inner conflict there, and listening to your solid self is what builds what I call a healthy container, life container. So I believe that we all have a space. I just call it a container, and we have cracks in our container. The first step to building a solid container is living in your solid self, which is really hard to do because it could mean, Going back to school. That's what it meant for me. It could mean leaving a career. It could mean sending parents to voicemail. It could mean losing friends. Like really hard things, you know. And also you're trusting your solid self without any guarantees because you don't know what's on the other side. And I think that's the hardest thing is like, it was easier for me because I had nothing. So I didn't have friends. I didn't have a sense of self. I was just, you know, I had to think about how I was going to pay my bills. And I had just left a marriage and a career. So I really didn't have anything to lose. So when you don't have a lot to lose, it's easier. It would be different now today with family and a career and, you know, property. And it's just it's a lot heavier to make bigger decisions. But every day I woke up and I said, what would pulling for my solid self look like? And then I realized, because they're not just big things, like if I went into the gym, am I being my solid self or am I being pseudo? Am I exchanging my truth for some kind of membership, right? So I would act differently, say at the CrossFit box where I was more my solid self than say I was at like, say some fancy party. I was very pseudo. Or if I was trying to impress someone. So I was just checking in with myself and saying, oh, depending on where I'm at, I have this tug. So with this person, I feel very pseudo. With this person, I feel a little solid. Where's that coming from? What would it look like for me to pull more from my solid self? So as a practice, that was step one for me, right? To build this kind of safe life container. Imagine like a greenhouse. And the more that you do these things as a way of life, the safer that container is, which promotes growth and evolution. If you don't do these things, if you are living more in pseudo than solid, there's cracks in your container which stunts growth, right? So instead of a greenhouse, then it kind of becomes a prison. So that was step one. And so my question to you is, in your current life today, where are you the most pseudo? And what would it look like to actually be more in your solid self? Usually with our kids, we're pretty solid, you know. A lot of times with our friends, we're pretty solid, depending on the friend. A lot of us in relationships are pseudo. A lot of us in work are pseudo because it's, you know, the iron fist boss or because it's not really, we're just doing it for the money or whatever. But where in your life, if you think about from the time you wake up to when you go to sleep, where do you feel the most pseudo, the most inauthentic? And then what would it look like to, in that space, pull more from your solid self? What would that look like? Action, thought, behavior. I had a moment of this where I was working, because I tried to tuck my shirt in, and I tried to punch a clock, and I tried to be a therapist with the DSM under my arm, and I was working for a eating disorder treatment center, high-end Pasadena, like amazing salary, and I came in there all buttoned up, you know, with the fancy shoes. And they wanted me to run groups and pull from the intervention, the filing cabinet. They're just generic, cheesy interventions. And they're making money off insurance. That was safe. And one day I came up and I brought DVDs. This is how long ago it was. And speaking of the Breakfast Club, it's one of the movies I brought to use, it's cinema therapy, using movie clips as interventions through conversations, right? So I brought my DVDs and I was going to play these, and I did it. And the group, they loved it because it was refreshing and different. And the boss found out what I was doing, and I got fired that day. And so my pseudo, that was a fork in the road where I decided to pull for my solid self. But there was consequences because in that space, they only wanted my pseudo self. Everyone was scared there of the boss, right? So everyone was in pseudo. And then one day I decided to be more of John Kim and do something kind of different, creative. The consequence was, okay, you don't belong here. And again, I lost my job. When I was terrified. But I remember sitting with that, got fired, drove my little Ducati to a coffee shop, and I was like, God, I feel like I've swam too far to turn back now. Like I have to just stay in solid because there's going to be pushback. So whether you lose a friend or it doesn't matter what's going to happen. Now I'm losing jobs, the marriages. Like I'm just going to see what happens, right? And so sticking to my solid meant, okay, so if I'm going to really go full on that way, that actually means I don't want to punch a clock anymore. I want to punch the sky. and I'm not going to have an office, and I'm not going to tuck my shirt in. I'm just going to wear jeans and a t-shirt, and I'm going to meet people at coffee shops. What else does solid look like? Oh, I'll do a couple sessions at the park. There's a lake in Silver Lake. I'm going to walk around the lake. And then my pseudo was like, that's not what therapists do. What are you talking about? And then my solid was like, I don't care. I'm going to call myself a coach. And so that one decision, that was the moment where my entire career was invented. Like, that was the first domino in helping people in a different way. And then I created, then I thought, the system's broken. I want to create my own life coaching certification school. I created Catalyst course, which turned into Journey. And so so a lot of the stuff that kind of branched out from me pulling from my solid self became bigger than me. Then I kind of became a conduit, right? And I'm not for everyone, of course. But I was like, okay, I worked in treatment centers. I was very pseudo. And it felt like a saltwater fish in a fishbowl, right? Grayed out, scales. And then I started working unconventionally, or something in a way that felt more honest to me, outside coffee shops, like this kind of stuff. And I was doing a lot of webcam stuff, and back then it was AOL, no broadband. It was really frowned upon. Now it's like the standard. This is before Zoom. And I felt with my pseudo Clark Kent pushing a mail cart, and then I felt in my solid like I was wearing a cape. But I also felt very lonely. There was no one to back me. I just had to trust how I felt. And so I just doubled down. I just put all my chips every day on solid. And then from there, book deals and stuff. And even what we're doing here, to me, feels very solid. So the pseudo version of this is, let's get something fancy. There's a resort that just came out. Like, let's get, like kind of what a retreat should look like. Instead of your, troughs and home and and even these 3-day intensives I do at my home when people fly in, it's very solid. I don't really go to fancy restaurants. I go to this, I sprinkle some of the fancy stuff, but a burger shop that's been around, cash only, when you just sit at the counter, and like stuff that I enjoy, that I want to do. Ice, sauna, bring them into the CrossFit box, because the pseudo site says they're coming to see you, they're paying a lot of money, there better be like treatment and fancy stuff, but it's like, well, then now I'm pseudo, I'm gonna have less to offer, Anyway, so that was kind of the beginning. And so for you guys, just sit with the question, what would it look like to start pulling from my pseudo self? And I think the great artists, or at least people who have inspired me, what would it look like to start pulling from your solid self? They have all, so whether we're talking about Tarantino, Bruce Lee, Anthony Bourdain, like these are people that have been huge inspirations in me. Okay, David Bowie for sure. They're all super solid. Like when you see the opening of a Quentin Tarantino movie, whether you hate him or not, it's like, exactly, or you hear a David Bowie song, or those Anthony Bourdain documentaries. They're just so like signature them. So that's an example of being in a solid